Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. My name is Maria Silveira, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the USDA Climate Hubs and the Long-Term Agro-Ecosystem Research Network, I'd like to welcome you to the 7th presentation in the series of 11 webinars focused on grazing land management and soil carbon. The goal of this series is to provide an update on the knowns and unknowns about the influence of management on soil carbon dynamics in grazing lands of the continental United States. Today's presentation will be followed by a short Q&A section, so please type your questions for the speaker in the Q&A tool at any time during or after presentation. Also, today's webinar will be concluded promptly at 45 minutes past the hour. The title of today's presentation is Preliminary Assessment of Land Use and Pasture Management on Soil Carbon and Nitrogen in the Kentucky Bluegrass Major Land Resource Area. Today's speaker is Dr. Alan Franzlubbers. Dr. Franzlubbers is a research ecologist with the USDA-ARS in Raleigh, North Carolina, and his research is mainly focused on soil ecology and management. Dr. Franzlubbers has a leadership role in the USDA Southeastern Region Climate Hub, and he also serves on the board of directors for the American Forage and Grassland Council. With that, Dr. Franzlubbers, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good day. My name is Alan Franzlubbers. I'm with the USDA Agriculture Research Service in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thanks for joining me today. I want to talk to you a little bit about this preliminary assessment of land use and pasture management on soil carbon and nitrogen in the Kentucky Bluegrass Major Land Resource Area. There's a perception that tall, deep-rooted grasses will promote deep accumulation of soil organic carbon. Now, this perception is verified by the observations by Dr. Weaver in the Sandhills of Nebraska, in that roots penetrate up to 5 feet deep, or even deeper in some cases. And so certainly roots are penetrating deep in the profile, but is soil organic carbon accumulating at those depths? Well, Dr. Weaver also measured the relative root mass, and he found that in the top 6 inches, nearly 75% of the roots of these native warm season grasses were in the top 6 inches, and more than 90% were in the top 12 inches. So roots are penetrating deep, but most of the roots are residing in the top foot of soil. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the root zone enrichment. So there's a concept paper that describes this. At least a few examples of this were given in this paper. This is in Agriculture and Environmental Letters in 2020. There are assumptions with the root zone enrichment, and the first is the concentration of soil organic carbon below 12 inches is affected primarily by petagenesis and not by contemporary management. This is a key assumption, that the carbon below 12 inches is really affected mostly by petagenesis. Now, absolutely it won't be only affected, but it's primarily affected there. And historical degradative management would have led to low surface soil organic carbon. This is true in many regions of the southeastern U.S. because we had severe erosion and it has removed that organic carbon and it resides into our rivers and into the ocean. The third assumption is that bulk density is inversely proportional to soil organic carbon. And this is observed in many studies, and so it's a pretty stable assumption. But it's needed to be made because it's hard to get good, accurate estimates of bulk density deeper in the profile. And the fourth assumption is that a mathematical fit of soil organic carbon depth distribution is relatively accurate. And I'm going to show you an example how the data can be fit to this mathematical function. This is a typical distribution of organic matter where the concentration of organic matter is high near the surface and it declines very precipitously with depth in the profile. And you see that after about 1 foot of depth, or 12 inches or 30 centimeters, the concentration is relatively stable and it's not changing nearly as much as it is in the top 12 inches. This profile was taken in the mountain region of North Carolina in Haywood County. The reason that this distribution is important is that at 12-inch depth, there can be a baseline carbon concentration that's indicated by this curve. We can measure it right there if we got soil only from that depth. And the curve allows us to get accurate estimates throughout the whole profile. So this baseline condition is subtracted from the calculation of the total carbon, and that leaves the root zone enrichment, which is the summation of 2-inch depth increments shown here in green. And this is an important condition of calculation because the carbon of the total is determined from the regression line. But the baseline is important because that's something that each soil profile gives to the condition, and we need to subtract that so we can calculate root zone enrichment. Well, the sampling locations were done in Kentucky on 30 farms. 100 fields were sampled, and that was roughly 2 profiles per field, giving us 198 soil profiles. This was sampled this past winter on 13 sampling dates from anywhere from the end of October, a little bit into December, and then reaching out back again in March to finish the project. I divided the region into 3 areas simply to look at a little bit of analysis there. The counties were Hardin, Meade, and Spencer in the west, Anderson, Scott, Shelby, and Woodford in the central portion, and Bath, Bourbon, Clark, Madison, and Montgomery in the eastern part of the Bluegrass MLRA primary. And this was the west, central, and east regions. The number of fields were mostly in the east and in the central, but there were some in the western part, which was extending the Bluegrass region a little bit farther west. Farms were typically selected through the cooperation of this man right here, Dr. Greg Halick. He's at the University of Kentucky. We have a collaboration on other projects, and I wanted to share the results with you because of this collaboration. So he gathered up some farms that he's been working with, and he also contacted county extension agents, who are some of them pictured here, along with some of the farmers that were in the study. Sampling was done by hand tools only. Essentially, walking out with the 2 hands full, was able to take a push probe and push into the ground for the top 4 inches of soil, then to go into the soil profile deeper with the drill auger that went in through the bucket, the hole in the bucket there, and augered out the soil from 4 to 12 inches and from 12 to 24 inches. And at each soil profile was actually a compilation of 5 cores out of the pasture, and then 2 repeats in that pasture. There was also a ring of surface residue that was measured, the steel ring in the middle there, and everything was put into bags and brought back to the truck, dried overnight, and then dried further in the laboratory. At each farm, there was a query that was given through Google Forms about the management history. And there were a series of questions that were typical farm management operations. And this was so that I could get a relatively fair estimate of what the conditions were for each soil profile, so that then some management evaluation could take place. Well, the soil texture in the Bluegrass region is well known to be silt loam and silty clay loam soils, and that's what we measured here. Almost all of the profiles were silt loam and silty clay loam, a few outliers in the loam and the silty clay, as well as the clay loams category, but most of them in the silt loam and silty clay loam. There was a slight increase in clay content going from west to east. And this difference was very small, approximately 3% clay only, but it was significant because of the large number of samples that were taken. Whereas the silt actually was in reverse. There was more silt in the west and central than in the east. And sand was greater in the east as well. So there was more clay and more sand in the east. And so this was just an observation that there are small changes that occur, and with large numbers of soil profiles that can be measured, we can get fairly small differences that are significant. The number of fields sampled is listed here on the bottom. There were 5 conventionally tilled cropland fields, 17 no-till cropland fields, 79 grassland fields, and 2 woodland fields. So the woodland and the conventional till cropland were not sampled very extensively, but the focus in the study was really about grasslands. And there were a number of farms that had no-till cropland as well, and so those were sampled. And these variations are shown here, and this is shown also in the standard error estimates, where the woodland has a very large standard error because it only had 2 observations, whereas the grassland has a very small error because it had so many more observations. And here soil pH is generally the soil pH. The only effect really that was significant was that no tillage was lower than under grassland and conventional tillage. The Mehlich 3 soil test phosphorus was generally adequate. This dotted line shows the sufficiency level, at least from the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, where these samples were analyzed. It shows that almost all fields were sufficient in phosphorus. There were no statistical differences in the land uses in soil test phosphorus, but you see the large variation that occurred in all of the systems because there was among farm variations. Variation in soil test potassium was also minimal in that there were no land use differences, although there were differences among the fields and among farms, and hence the large variations associated with each mean value. But all of them were sufficient, and there was no limitation of potassium in these systems, at least based on the soil test. As regards to the aggregation, soil stability index is the index of the quantity, a fraction of 1, that the soil falls apart when immersed into water and gently oscillated for 10 minutes. And you can see here there's a clear distinction between the conventional till cropland lowest value, whereas no-till cropland is increasing compared to the conventional tillage, and grassland and woodland having values greater than under no tillage. These are significant differences, and they're also practically significant because when rainfall occurs under a bare, exposed soil, it tends to wash away. Whereas soil that's covered with no-till cropland and soil that's covered permanently with a perennial grassland and woodland surface, they're very highly protected. And these data bear that out, that the soils are very different at the surface, and these are from the top 4 inches of depth. The soil test biological activity also showed this general trend from increasing from conventional tillage to no tillage, and then grassland and woodland greater than no tillage. And the significance was only between no tillage and grassland because of the smaller error bars there. We just simply didn't have enough conventional till cropland fields. But I would also point out that some of the conventional till cropland fields were in rotation between pasture and cropland. Now we get to the results that I'm really interested in of calculating is the root zone enrichment of soil organic carbon. This is again the concentration or the content of the carbon that is in excess of the baseline condition. That baseline condition was subtracted from each profile. Each profile has its own baseline condition, and then the root zone enrichment is calculated. We see generally here that the root zone enrichment of carbon in metric tons of CO2 per acre there is some value in the conventional till cropland, but there's a trend where the no-till cropland is greater than conventional till cropland, and certainly grassland is much greater than the cropland situations. And the woodland, because of very few observation, is no different than the grassland. These values of roughly in the grassland of roughly 54 metric tons of CO2 per acre are highly significant and actually practically relevant, that the grasslands have a great role to play in sequestering carbon and taking that atmospheric carbon and putting it into the ground and keeping it in the ground. Now, I'm going to share with you a little bit of a complex diagram that needs some explanation. This is not from this study here, but this is from the Southeastern United States database of 822 soil profiles of the root zone enrichment of total soil nitrogen. This is published in a paper this year where these data were presented so that we could get some estimate of what is the relevance of each farm. Are they with their peers, or are they outside of their peer group? So I'll just explain that in the conventional tillage in yellow here, we have a point here. These are not individual field observations. These are statistical distributions in the conventional till cropland, where this first dot circle here represents 5% of the values. The next is 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, percent. Maybe see if I didn't miss one. I think I missed one in there. It's hidden behind another point there. Here's the 80% and here is the 95%. And the median value is here in this vertical bar. Similarly, the no tillage has a 5, a 20, a 40, 60, 80, and 95%, and the median being here with this vertical bar here. And so on for the woodland and the grassland. So these lines here are all of this curve. It represents all of the 822 values. And then I'm going to give you an idea that, well, the first thing to notice here is that this follows the same trend as the carbon, where the conventional tillage is low, the no tillage is higher, considerably higher. The grassland is also considerably much higher than the other two, and the woodland actually tends to go back down towards the no-till situation. Now, in Kentucky, the middle 50% of the observations, the 25 to 75% range, is in this green bar here, indicating that it matches the southeastern U.S. database. It matches quite well because the median value for the southeastern U.S. database falls within this box. And the box is a little bit skewed to the right. And we'll see that the median values for all land uses in the southeastern U.S. would be a value of 2.11. That would be somewhere here in the middle. The southeastern grassland is here at 2.98. And the Kentucky grassland is a little bit higher, about 16% higher at 3.46. So Kentucky grassland fields, at least from this survey of these 30 farms, would indicate that they're definitely within the range of the rest of the southeastern U.S., but maybe even a little bit higher. So there's significant total soil nitrogen, which is a component of organic matter and a key indicator of organic matter. Well, I don't have much information to share with you on pasture management yet because I'm still assembling the information from each individual farmer. So pasture management effects are to be explored yet, and they'll be reported when they are available. But until then, I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what they could be like from a similar survey that I did in Virginia a couple years ago. And this was from also roughly 30 farms, 94 pastures, and a total of 304 profiles. Also, this study had the same conventional till cropland, no-till cropland, grassland, and woodland land use categories. And you see here in the graphic on the left, soil test biological activity, and the mean values that are plotted here. Again, very similar type of results. The lowest value with the conventional tillage, no tillage having a considerably higher value, and woodland near that of the no-till cropland. But I want to show you the specific results for the grassland because the statement that soil biological activity can be managed and optimally managed pastures may have greater potential than other land uses is revealed in this graphic here, where stocking rate is influencing the soil test biological activity quite dramatically. There's an optimal stocking rate of approximately 1 head per acre. In this case, that's what in this Virginia survey that showed that that's where there was an optimization of soil test biological activity. Lower stocking rates led to lower biological activity, and higher stocking rates led to higher or lower soil test biological activity also because likely plant productivity was being limited. The second observation in this Virginia study was that rotational stocking marginally stored more soil carbon than continuous stocking, but high frequency moves may not necessarily be better. This may be a little bit of a surprise to you, but the data are what they are based on what was observed. So in this case, root zone enrichment of soil organic carbon, shown here on the left, is lowest in the conventional tillage. It's considerably higher under no-till cropland, and also considerably higher than in the woodland. Now, with grasslands, the values of the root zone enrichment of soil organic carbon certainly were almost as high as the woodland, and in some cases higher or equally high as the woodland. And you see here that in the middle here, the monthly stocking moves had the greatest level, and it was greater than continuous stocking or with no stocking moves. But the values of more frequently moving stalks on the landscape, there was no benefit to that, at least observed in this survey where the farmers told me what they actually did. So in this case, there is no clear evidence that more frequent moves leads to higher soil organic carbon in the soil profile. The next observation was that nitrogen fertilization on mature pastures may not always be needed, as soil biological activity is an important factor. Here you see on the left axis, or left panel here, is net nitrogen mineralization as a function of land use, where conventional tillage is low, no-till cropland considerably greater, and woodland a little bit greater than the no-till cropland. With the grasslands, it was that most of the grasslands were greater than any of the other land uses. First of all, that's the first observation. But there didn't seem to be any benefit, or actually a decrease benefit, of adding fertilization to the net nitrogen mineralization potential. So no nitrogen fertilization during the past 10 years led to equally greater or as greater than when those pastures were fertilized with nitrogen. I'm not sure that this is absolutely the case, of course, because the management history is complicated. It was not a research study where it was absolutely defined whether it was 0 or 40 or 80 pounds per acre per year every year, but on average, this is what the farmers told me were occurring. The fourth and final observation was that soil biological activity can be enhanced with organic amendments, a primary component being imported hay. The basal soil respiration is another component of biological activity, where conventional till cropland is the lowest, no-till cropland considerably greater than conventional till cropland, and woodland much greater than the no-till cropland as well. And in the pasture situations where there was no hay fed, there seemed to be lower basal soil respiration. But when there was increasing amount of hay fed, there was greater basal soil respiration. So importing that hay onto the pasture can lead to greater basal soil respiration because it's feeding the microbes in the soil. And this is over, of course, a history of time. This is not just a one-year kind of thing, but this is over 20 to 40 years of this management that was reported by the farmers. So, in conclusion, I wanted to state that grasslands in the Kentucky Bluegrass region have enriched soil test biological activity and soil organic matter near the surface. This is an important observation. We need to characterize the depth distribution because in the southeastern U.S. and likely in other regions as well, there's an influence of the surface 12 inches roughly that are really impacting organic matter change and not necessarily the total stock. The root zone enrichment calculations revealed high levels of total soil nitrogen accumulation. This is an important aspect of pastures because we can perhaps cut down on a little bit of the fertilizer inputs, but also use our pastures more sustainably so that they become the ecosystem that they're meant to be, that they're a sustainable ecosystem where nutrients are recycled. And root zone enrichments in Kentucky are following a similar pattern observed in the greater southeastern U.S. And so this is a pleasant result that actually the results don't diverge greatly, but of course we want to know what happens in each physiographic region so that we can better understand what is the effect of management throughout the country. Well, thanks for your attention on this presentation on this preliminary assessment of land use and pasture management. And this happened to be from Kentucky Bluegrass Major Land Resource Area, but I wanted to include a little bit about the results that I have from Virginia as well. If you have questions, I look forward to answering them in the Q&A afterwards, as well as if you wanted to email me, I'd be glad to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. Just want to remind everyone that after the Q&A section, we're going to have a short poll for participants to complete. So I appreciate if you could please complete the short poll. It will be after the Q&A. Dr. Franzlubbers, there's a couple questions in the Q&A. I will start with the more methodological questions. So one of the questions is, in the sampling protocol, were roots removed from the soil? So if you can just provide a little bit more information on how the soils were processed before laboratory analysis.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Yes, thanks for the question. Also, that the roots were generally, if they were visible, they were picked from the soil. It's pretty difficult in a grassland soil to actually remove all roots because there are a lot of fine roots that are in there. So it was a general approach to pick out coarse roots and any sort of plant debris and leave only the soil.
Thank you, Alan. Also, another methodological question related to the grassland. To what extent do they differ the management practice, such as haying, grazing, type of plants? If you can provide just a brief overview of the different grasslands in the study.
Yes, in Kentucky, again, I have a management query that I put out to the farmers, and I hope to get all that information assembled. So, but in general, I would say that most of the pastures were grazed by cattle. And then there were a couple hay fields, but not so many hay fields as in previous investigations, but most of them grazed cool season grasses in general.
Another question kind of related to the management, especially where hay was used. The question was, did the fields with high basal, with the high respiration and more bales added? The question is, did they also have higher animal density? Was just the hay the difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in general, this is all from the Virginia study. So what I asked the producers was how many bales of hay they typically fed on the farm and what was their total grazable acres. And so I made that calculation of hay per acre that they were supplying. Now, that doesn't mean that it was on a specific field that I measured. That was a farm level calculation. And so in general, if they're feeding more bales of hay, probably the stocking rate would be higher as well. And that would be a logical conclusion. But I don't have all of that so detailed, let's say, specific. And I just wanted to say that also that these kinds of surveys are a little bit more difficult because we're talking about history in the last few years, which farmers tend to remember, which is all good. But there's a history prior to that, and there may be some legacy effects that carry over. So it's not the easiest always to interpret. But let's just say that I'm trying my best to be as fair as possible.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation. There's another question also related to the stocking rate. If there could be any, if you could fit linear or some sort of relationship between stocking rates and the soil respiration. If you, based on your results, if you could infer any relationship between stocking rate and soil respiration.
Right. Almost all of the organic matter associations, including the respiration, they tended to follow that polynomial function where there was an optimization at about 1 head per acre. It seems very intense, actually, but we don't have as many observations on the very high stocking rate. And there were, let's say, a few observations also on the low stocking rate. So this points to the need for maybe a little bit more, a few greater number of studies that have this observation of stocking rate, but also then that make the measurements in the soil. So yes, I welcome other studies to be able to answer that.
Thank you, Alan. There's 2 questions related to nitrogen. One is, to what extent nitrogen in grazing land, in pasture lands, can be vulnerable to losses? So that was question part A. Part B is the relationship. Is there a relationship between soil health and nitrogen fertilizer, where the yield's high or low? So the first is, the weathers can be susceptible to losses, and the second one was whether there was a relationship between nitrogen and soil health and maybe forage production.
Sure, I think it's a great set of questions. Understanding this all is maybe a little bit complicated. First of all, there are losses in a pasture system. Of course, we know that there's nitrogen that's soluble in the urine and that potentially could be volatilized and potentially denitrified as well. So there are a couple mechanisms that can occur there. The leaching or runoff, I think, is probably not as prevalent, let's say. But leaching, of course, could if it's a very porous soil. But I think that is absorbed by the organisms in soil. It's not necessarily leached dramatically, but there are loss mechanisms. The grassland systems are not completely conserving nitrogen, but I believe that because of the root system that is developed under the perennial grass systems, there's more opportunity for recapturing that nitrogen. With that said, I can't give you a firm estimate of the amount, but I believe that because some producers are reducing their nitrogen input, it's logical that they can when the pastures are mature. Because a mature pasture has this accumulation of total nitrogen that is then mineralizable, and that feeds the root systems on a kind of a daily basis. And that is possible only because of the accumulation of carbon that really has to be associated with this nitrogen. So those producers that have reduced their nitrogen fertilizer input are likely not to have necessarily bursts of plant growth that can occur. But we often, well, in the studies that we've conducted where we apply nitrogen to fall stockpile or tall fescue in this case, we don't see the forage growth or the forage quality increase dramatically. And so that tells me that, of course, there's nitrogen being supplied to the pasture. I would just believe that in a mature pasture, an important mature pasture might be something 10 years or greater, that if there's a good grazing approach, appropriate stocking rate, good stocking method, there will be recirculation of that nitrogen in the pasture ecosystem. How we get that to recirculate uniformly distributed, that's where, maybe hay distribution comes in, or feeding areas so that they're not concentrated. Getting, rotational stocking has its role to play in just redistributing those nutrients. So there can be losses, but there's also that recycling that occurs. That's my answer for that.
Okay, thank you. There's another question relative to the approach that you use to describe the data. So you summarize everything for the region. So the question from this participant is whether, if you segregate the data by smaller regions, do you think that the message would change completely? Instead of presenting for the entire region, maybe take into consideration some difference in soil type or management?
Sure, it's a very good question. I think that what I'm trying to do with root zone enrichment is actually already trying to understand the regional differences that are there. Certainly, different textural conditions can lead to different baseline conditions. And sometimes even in the same farm, the different landscape positions can lead to different baseline conditions. So this root zone enrichment calculation is really trying to account for that. But it's quite likely true that if we had conditions for, let's say, sort data by major land resource areas, or even smaller units than that, maybe a county level, all of that could be leading to some variations that could be separated. But I think that in general, I'm seeing a lot of pattern that once we remove the baseline condition, the root zone enrichment is now giving a more normalized response. So we need more data, of course, but at this point, I think the information is suggesting that using major land resource area is a good way to go, but even broader within the whole southeastern U.S. is still an appropriate region to look at. Until we have more data, I can give that answer.
Thank you, Alan. It's also a question regarding the livestock, the role of livestock on both the croplands and the grassland. To what extent do you think the presence of livestock contributes to greater organic matter and biological activity, both on the grassland and the no-till cropland system?
Yeah, livestock are a key component of agricultural systems. I think the issue with, my view is that the information that we've collected so far would suggest that perennial grasses and forages in general, just perennial forages in general, are important as the first step in building organic matter. That perennial root system is really important. The residues that accumulate at the surface because of the perennial nature of that plant community, they are really important in jump-starting the soil organic matter cycle. Animals consuming that enhance the decomposition and the nutrient cycling, and that they are a key component. But they're not. If you only had animals and no forage production, I think we would have degradation of soil resources. And so I think it's not really the animal is important, but it's not we need to have the forage base. And that is really important, whether that's in a grazing system or in a cropland system. The cropland system, annual cover crops can work to provide that forage base, but again, they're annual, and then that can be, we can have some severe trampling sometimes. But in general, I think that forage base is also good, and the animals just enhance the nutrient cycling that's occurring.
Thank you, Alan. Another question related to carbon budget as a whole. So the question is if the carbon captured by the grassland is enough to neutralize the emissions from that grazing land system, and the person is referring to a previous presentation where they saw that the presenter showed that the sequestration equals emission. So do you have an idea what will be the case for this region?
Yeah, I think in general there is a potential for sequestering quite a lot of the emissions that occur. Now it depends on the carrying capacity of the land. So the more animals, of course, the more emissions of methane that can occur. But in general, and of course, the carbon sequestration is not infinite. There's going to be a threshold for the saturation of the organic matter at some level. Now, saturation really only occurs when the inputs and outputs are in steady state, and that can vary because our management can actually change the inputs and the outputs. So that I think is not a firm steady state condition, but in general, the limited data that I've observed, I would say that there's a great potential for offsetting a large amount of the methane emissions. And of course, cattle are not only on pasture or one particular pasture for their whole life cycle, and so the boundary conditions of that assessment need to be scrutinized pretty intensely. But there is a large offset, yes.
Alan, there was a couple questions asking, I don't know if you want to put the slides back on, but if you could revisit how the baseline carbon stock by soil profile was computed. If you can just go back and just briefly explain. I think there's some confusion.
I don't have my presentation available at the moment, so I will try to explain it. In that the baseline condition is if we're talking about soil organic carbon, it's the carbon concentration at 12-inch depth. So when we make this regression curve, so we're fitting the data to a natural logarithmic function, and the point where the regression curve intersects at 12-inch depth, that's the carbon concentration that I'm using as the baseline condition. Because I'm making the assumption that the top 12 inches is influenced by management, and that the soil column below 12 inches is generally not influenced by management. So the 12-inch depth is the point where the baseline condition is calculated.
Thank you, and I apologize. I forgot that presentation was not available. There's also a question regarding carbon longevity, and if you believe that the carbon that is sequestered in the top layers could eventually become, the soil could eventually become saturated with carbon, and what happened if that occurs?
Yeah, I do believe that carbon can be saturated near the surface. Absolutely. Because there is a kind of a steady state condition that we should expect. There are going to be some slight fluctuations from year to year because grass grows better when it rains properly or evenly distributed. And then, of course, the decomposition has that opposite function. And they're not always tightly coupled. So there can be some variation, but in general, there's saturation that will occur. And we should accept that saturation occurs at some point. I don't know that we know the level for each of the regions that we're in. That's the issue. We need to find out what kind of management can be deployed and what does that management then give to the soil as far as the surface carbon. But we know from the prairie remnants that we've had, we can store a lot of carbon in soil. And I think in general, that's only a guide. Each soil might have a different potential based on the management conditions that we offer. We can artificially increase carbon input. So there are a lot of choices that we can make, but carbon saturation occurs. It is something that we should try to accept, but that's what we need to strive for, right? We want to have some saturated soils that are really absorbent, because then they will absorb water. They will cycle nutrients. They will mitigate some of the greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is for all of us as an agricultural community to strive for.
Thank you. There's also a question whether you think that there's a laboratory procedure or analysis that can determine the potential mineralizable nitrogen, maybe different seasons, winter versus summer. I guess the question is if there's a reliable metric to quantify how much nitrogen can be potentially mineralizable.
Right. Okay. This question is really interesting because the nitrogen mineralization can be defined as potential. Potential means that there's a standard set of conditions, an optimized set of temperature and moisture conditions primarily. Those two factors determine the potential. So when the temperature is warmer, when the soil is adequately moist and in balance with the air, then it will mineralize as much as the soil allows it to. And so that's potential mineralization. So in my analyses, I always determine nitrogen mineralization potential. I mean, I would say almost always, is that we incubate the soil for 24 days at 25 degrees Celsius, 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and 50% water-filled pore space. With that in mind, this is a standard set, and so that soils can be compared, and that way we get a potential nitrogen mineralization. If one chooses a different approach, the results might be a different number, but in general, they should scale to the same levels. And so we can have different approaches towards nitrogen mineralization potential, but the methodologies are important as what the constraints are.
As a follow-up question on the same issue that you're discussing, is there a relationship between potential nitrogen mineralization to actual nitrogen fertilizer responses? So I guess whether that overlaps with what is available for the plant.
Yeah. Okay, I think I understand the question, and I hope that I'm getting it right, in that the question might allude to the fact that if the soil has a high nitrogen mineralization potential, can fertilizer maybe be reduced? Because actually the potential nitrogen mineralization would suggest that the soil has this capacity to release nitrogen to the plants, and that nitrogen then can be taken up. And now potential nitrogen mineralization that is determined under optimum conditions, but the field, our fields don't necessarily receive optimal conditions. And it becomes the issue. It's like we want to be able to determine potential because it's more standardized. But in the field, one would have to measure it as the conditions are evolving in the field. So the temperature fluctuates, the moisture fluctuates, and that will determine how much of that potential is actually realized. Okay, now in a stable environment, let's say just within a region where you know that the conditions are consistent from year to year, and generally in the Southeast, let's say just say that it's generally warm, it's generally moist. If we can meet those conditions, then from year to year, we should be able to fit the nitrogen fertilizer requirement to the potential because it's repeatable. Now, taking that into a drought year, that might not work so well. But there is potential. If we know that nitrogen mineralization is high, then fertilizer need for nitrogen should be low. And similarly, when nitrogen mineralization potential is low, then fertilizer input will need to be higher.
Thank you so much, Alan. We're approaching the 45-minute past the hour. And I also want to remind everyone, please, to stay for a few extra minutes to fill out the poll. And thank you so much, Alan. And Thank you, everyone, for attending this section of the Grazing Land Management and Soil Carbon webinar series. Please note that a link to the recording of today's presentation will be available on the website. And also remind everyone to please join us for our November 4th webinar. The title of the webinar is Grazing Land Management and Soil Carbon, Results and Insights from the Western Great Plains. Presenter will be Dr. Justin Derner from USDA-ARS. We hope to see you then, and please stay a few extra minutes to respond to the poll. Thank you so much, Dr. Franzlubbers, and everyone who attended today's webinar.
Thank you, Maria.